So today we're doing chapter 12, and I have to apologize in advance because I have a cold, although it might work in my favor actually because things are starting to heat up a little bit in our little story here, and maybe my raspiness will, I don't know, add to the mood. I don't know. If it doesn't, I'm sorry. I apologize. But anyway, quick recap from last week. I still don't know where to look. Netherfield Ball. They were at the Netherfield Ball, and it wasn't exactly a great experience for Elizabeth, and she kind of ended it on a sour note, and except that Mr. Bingley stopped her and asked if he could come to Longbourn the following day and talk to her about something really important that she has no idea. Well, she has an idea. She thinks it's because he wants to ask her opinion about how to propose to her sister Jane. So she's kind of not really looking forward to it, to be honest. And that's where we are. So let's just jump right in. Here we go. The next morning, the entire Bennet family awoke to an acute case of post-ball letdown. Elizabeth slept in till the early afternoon, then reluctantly left the tomb-like silence of her bedroom for the land of the living. The women were lounging in the drawing-room, discussing highlights of the previous evening, while their father had closed himself in his library as usual. Also, I made a couple of adjustments to the text in this chapter, so if you notice them, let me know. If you don't, then that's fine too, but I just wanted to say that. Yeah. So it might sound a little different this time. Okay, where was I? By the time Elizabeth looked out the window and saw Mr. Bingley riding toward the house, she was so eager to leave it she didn't care. She didn't even care what might follow. She snuck quickly and quietly to the door, determined not to let anyone else see him, as it would raise all manner of questions later, and hurried to meet him as fast as her slippers would allow. He pulled on the reins when he saw her running toward him and called out, "Is everything all right?" "Absolutely," she croaked between breaths, clutching the cramp in her side. "I just wanted to avoid prying eyes and ears." It was only then Elizabeth noticed the second horse. "Why did you bring two horses, Mr. Bingley?" she asked, eyeing them warily. "I thought perhaps you might like to ride your own horse this time." Elizabeth stared wistfully at the other mare. It was beautiful. The silky coat was dapple gray and glossy, the mane and tail pure white. She watched it toss its great head and sidle impatiently. "No, I can't." Mr. Bingley jumped down from his horse and walked the other one over to her. "Are you certain?" he asked. "The gentleman who loaned her assured me she is exceedingly gentle. Her name is Theodora." "She's gorgeous," Elizabeth replied breathlessly. She slowly ran her hand down the sleek forehead. "I just don't think I can ride by myself." She gave him an apologetic look. Mr. Bingley considered her for a moment. "I myself took a bad fall once." Elizabeth stopped stroking the horse and looked up at him. "You did?" "Yes, shortly after the death of my mother. I was at Eton at the time. Not having been made aware of the extent of her illness, the news of her death came as a great shock. I saddled one of the school's horses and rode until dark. On the way back, the horse was spooked by a covey of partridges, and I was thrown. I do not remember much of anything until I awoke in the infirmary, my head wrapped in bandages." "I am so sorry." "It took quite a while to regain the courage to ride again. However, once I did, I found it to be tremendously therapeutic." He watched her absent-mindedly begin stroking the horse again. "Perhaps you might feel the same if you gave it a try?" She chewed her lip in trepidation, her eyes reluctantly meeting his once more. "Trust me," Mr. Bingley said, smiling. Letting out a long, shuddering breath, Elizabeth approached the horse. "You can do this. You rode a horse before, you can do it again," she mumbled to herself. She gave him one last look of uncertainty. "Yes, but that was with his arms around me." Mr. Bingley gave her an encouraging nod. Elizabeth inhaled deeply and furrowed her brow in determination. She was not going to allow fear to control her anymore. It was time to take charge of her life, unconscious or not. No more damsel in distress. She was going to be the heroine of her own story. After all, was she, or was she not, a 21st century woman? She had a successful job, the right to vote. She wore pants, for crying out loud. She was not an oppressed, underprivileged woman of the 1800s, and she certainly did not need a man to do this for her when there was a wall of trophies at her parents' house that proved she was more than capable of doing it herself. She was going to stop acting like a wounded animal, show this man what she was made of, and ride this blasted horse. Get it, girl. Glowing with tenacity, Elizabeth turned confidently toward the saddle. That is, she would ride this blasted horse just as soon as she figured out how to get up onto it in a 19th century gown and restrictive corset. Elizabeth put her hands up on the pommel and was contemplating trying to get one foot into the stirrup when she suddenly felt Mr. Bingley's hands on her waist. As he lifted her onto the saddle, she swung her leg over to the other side and adjusted the folds of her dress. Then she looked down and gave him a sheepish smile. Then again, a little help never hurt anyone. Elizabeth gathered the reins in her hand and felt her heart lurch as the horse moved suddenly. All right, Theodora, we are in this together now, whether we like it or not, so let's be friends, okay? She waited until Mr. Bingley had mounted his own horse, then led hers into pace alongside his. She could feel her confidence mounting. Why on earth had it taken her this long to ride again? Even Theodora seemed to have faith in her, responding to her commands as seamlessly as though they had been riding together for years instead of minutes. As Elizabeth increased the pace to a canter, she could practically hear Arrowsmith's back in the saddle and the steady beat of the hooves against the hard ground, which she used to play on her way to the stables before competitions when she was younger. Her exultation must have shown in her face, because when Elizabeth looked over at Mr. Bingley, he was grinning from ear to ear, clearly impressed with her ability. "How do you feel?" he asked. "I feel..." Giving Mr. Bingley a mischievous smile, Elizabeth challenged, "like finding out if you can keep up." Then she squeezed her legs against Theodora's side and stood in the stirrups as the horse broke into a gallop. She felt a rush of pure adrenaline as they raced each other across the countryside, trees and stone fences passing by in a blur of shapes and colors. The wind was cool on her face and deafening in her ears, pushing her forcibly backward as she hurtled effortlessly forward. It made her feel invincible. It made her feel alive. She saw Mr. Bingley slow his horse to a trot and followed his lead. When they came to a tree beside a broad lake, he jumped down from the horse and tied the reins to a branch. Then he helped Elizabeth down. "Thank you," she expressed. "Really, I don't think I could ever thank you enough." Mr. Bingley smiled. "I did nothing, Miss Elizabeth. The credit is entirely yours." He tied her horse's reins and turned to face her. "I must say, I have never seen riding of that caliber in my life," he claimed. "You are easily the most extraordinary woman I have ever had the pleasure of being acquainted with." She felt herself instinctually move toward him, then stopped. Instead, she turned to gently run her hand along the horse's side. "Thank you, Theodora," Elizabeth whispered softly as she touched her forehead. "What is your horse's name, Mr. Bingley?" "Her name is Isabel, after my mother," he replied. "You know, no one has ever asked me that before." Elizabeth stroked Isabel's muzzle before turning to see Mr. Bingley watching her with what appeared to be a troubled look in his eye. She wondered if he was about to confess his love for Jane, and felt her heart drop into her stomach as they began to walk slowly around the lake. She saw the ripples dance across the water, and despite her apprehension, couldn't help but think of the wet shirt scene from Pride and Prejudice, and chuckled to herself. "What are you thinking of?" "Oh, nothing." She tried and failed to hide her grin. "Please, apprise me," Mr. Bingley begged. "I am in need of a good laugh, believe me." Elizabeth gave him a withering look, and he added, "I will not recount it to anyone, I promise." "Okay, but it's going to sound stupid, so don't judge me. She inhaled. I was just remembering this scene in a movie, a novel, where Mr. Dart's Colin Firth jumped into a lake and went for a swim, which was completely out of character for him. The reaction from nearly every woman in the world who read about it was unbelievable. All that swooning over him in a wet shirt that you couldn't even see through, when a gentleman of his rank would never do something so ridiculous. Mr. Bingley wrinkled his forehead in thought, then raised a roguish eyebrow. I would. And he didn't even do it in an actual lake anyway. It was a tank inside a studio. Elizabeth turned her gaze from the horizon. What? He laughed and sat down in the grass. I said I would do something ridiculous like swim in a lake. She gave him a dubious look. No, you wouldn't. Mr. Bingley laughed again and began to take off his boots. Oh, yes, I would. Elizabeth stared in disbelief as Mr. Bingley pulled off his stockings and stood up, flexing his bare toes in the grass. He shrugged out of his jacket and threw it aside, then began loosening his cravat. Elizabeth jerked her head from side to side to make sure no one was watching, then arched an eyebrow in his direction. Was this really happening? Was this fantasy? Was this a fantasy her unconscious brain had concocted on the fly? It had to be, as stripteases were definitely not Regency appropriate, and neither was her being alone with him without a chaperone, for that matter. Elizabeth watched Mr. Bingley fling his cravat to one side. Then he unbuttoned his waistcoat and tossed it toward her, and began to walk slowly backward, smirking as he turned and dove effortlessly into the water. Even in my fantasy, I can't get the guy to lose the shirt completely. Honestly, that's just disappointing. Come on, brain, throw me a bone. She stood perfectly still with bated breath and waited for him to resurface. When he finally emerged, Mr. Bingley stood up and shook the water from his hair. He placed his hands on his hips and gave her a smug smile. When she saw how the thin fabric of his saturated shirt clung to the well-defined muscles of his arms and chest, Elizabeth made a mental apology to the miniseries, then sucked in her breath and chewed her bottom lip as inside her head 2 conflicting voices were having a heated battle for influence. Come on, bangers, you know you want to. Take it off. Do it. Do it now. Oh my God, Elizabeth, what is wrong with you? He's supposed to be just a friend. Her mouth fell open as she watched him pull his shirt up and over his head, exposing magnificent washboard abs that instantly ended the conflict. You have enough friends. Come in. The water is incredibly refreshing, Mr. Bingley called, tossing his shirt toward her. Do you know what that lake water is going to do to this dress? It will be ruined, she reasoned. Nonsense, he yelled back. That gown is made of cotton, not muslin. It will not be ruined in the least. He's got a point. And to think I believed you adventurous, having found you dangling from a tree the first moment I met you. Elizabeth raised her eyebrows defiantly and plopped down in the grass to kick off her slippers. She gave him a challenging look as she pulled off her stockings and stood up, hands on hips. Looking down at her gown, she decided that it really was not worth the risk. Cotton or not, it was far too pretty to get wet. She struggled with the buttons, then pulled it over her head and carefully folded it, laying it gently on top of Mr. Bingley's haphazardly abandoned jacket on the grass. She untied her petticoat, pulled it down over her hips, and stepped out of it, thanking her lucky stars that she was wearing her father's breeches underneath, with her chemise tucked tightly into them. She looked back at Mr. Bingley, who appeared to be in the midst of a eternal struggle, as he stared, unblinking at her, in her corset and breeches. Elizabeth smiled complacently, then walked to the water's edge and put her toe in before pulling it back out quickly. It's freezing! No, it is not, he cajoled, finding his voice. You get used to it. That is, if you are not too afraid to just dive right in. Elizabeth gave him another defiant look. Before she could change her mind, she dove in headfirst. The initial shock of the cold water against her skin took her breath away, and she could feel every nerve ending in her body scream in protest. She broke through the surface and gasped for breath, waiting for her body to adjust as she started to tread water. Turning around, she shrieked when she saw that Mr. Bingley was right behind her. He laughed at her reaction. In protest, she grabbed the top of his head and dunked it beneath the water, smiling triumphantly until he returned the favor and her mouth was invaded by a flood of dirty lake water, which, for some reason, made her sneeze. When she opened her eyes, Elizabeth noticed that he had disappeared under the water and hesitated before sinking beneath the surface to locate him in the murky green water. When she ran out of air, she pushed off from the grimy floor of the lake and rocketed to the top, shrieking once more in surprise as she opened her eyes and found Mr. Bingley's face inches from hers. Their laughter ebbed away as they both struggled to catch their breath. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she watched his eyes suddenly darken with desire, and she felt her body respond as he brought his face closer to hers. Her heart was now frantically attempting to escape her chest like a bird in a cage. As Mr. Bingley leaned in to kiss her, she closed her eyes and waited for their lips to meet, but suddenly her sister's heartbroken face came into focus in her mind, and Elizabeth jerked her head back abruptly. "What am I doing?" Mr. Bingley opened his eyes and gave her a disoriented look. Elizabeth pursed her lips in regret before blurting, "I'm freezing, aren't you?" Then she turned away from him and began swimming back to the edge. She sat on the grass and watched him walk out of the water past her, collecting articles of clothing on the way. She sat staring blankly across the lake and shivering until he came up beside her and silently draped his jacket around her shoulders. "Thank you," it'd be more like, "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes full of remorse. He gave her a rueful smile. "We should return you to Longbourn before you catch cold." The ride back was not enjoyable. Elizabeth's wet undergarments clung to her frigid skin like the anguish and frustration that shrouded her heavy heart. Whenever she glanced over at her companion, the unspoken tension between them was so heavy it was almost tangible. As they reached the same tree she had fallen out of into his arms what seemed like ages ago, he slowed his horse to a halt. "Would you like me to leave you here, away from prying eyes?" he asked. "It would certainly make things easier." He leapt down from his horse and reached out to help her dismount. As he lifted her down from the saddle, Mr. Bingley impulsively pulled her close to his body. For a moment, Elizabeth yielded, bringing her hands slowly down from his shoulders to his chest and allowing them to linger. Then, knowing she could not trust herself another second, she lowered her arms and backed away, removing herself from his embrace. Dropping into a quick curtsy, she turned to leave without a word, but felt his hand on her arm and turned back again. "Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Bingley exasperated, "before you leave, allow me to speak. I beg you." "Mr. Bingley, please." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She knew that her actions had been reprehensible. If he now doubted his love for Jane, it was entirely her fault. What was she thinking? How could she mess things up so badly in a story that was so perfect in its original? How could she allow things to get so out of hand? She was not only a terrible sister, but she was also a terrible person for letting it go that far when she knew full well he was meant to be for someone else. He was meant for someone else. Although, on the other hand, the more she thought about it, the more Elizabeth realized Mr. Bingley hadn't exactly been a shining specimen of integrity himself back there. One could even say the whole thing had been his fault, not hers. Him and that little striptease that would have corrupted a saint. This was precisely the reason they needed chaperones in the 1800s. Damn you, wet shirt seam. Even at the height of her indignation, Elizabeth had to admit her fabricated version was far more satisfying than the original. Well, at least she hadn't done anything she couldn't undo. Jane didn't have to know about this. She could just deny her feelings for him and force herself to think of him as just a friend, once more. Or for that matter, brother. She could do that, right? Yeah, right. That should be no problem at all, considering he just checked off the #1 scenario on every woman's sexual fantasy list. And maybe #2 with the night in the Netherfield Library. Who am I kidding? He is the list. Sighing in resignation, Elizabeth knew she had to bring Mr. Bingley's mind back to Jane. After all, Jane was the one he was meant to be with. It was the way the story went. And regardless of what almost happened between them, inevitably, he would still choose her because they were perfect for each other. Perfect. Elizabeth opened her mouth to remind him of her sister, then felt her breath catch in her chest as he reached out and took her hands in his without warning. He studied them carefully for a moment, then brought them to his lips and kissed them gently. She looked longingly from his lips up to his eyes, and he acknowledged her wistful expression with a confident smile. Miss Elizabeth, you must know that I am completely and irrevocably in love with you. Elizabeth was convinced the entire countryside must be able to hear that feverish drumming inside her chest. She watched in disbelief as Mr. Bingley dropped down on one knee, still holding her hands in his. From the first moment when I saw you at this very tree, I have loved you, heart and soul. Every word that has passed between us since then has only strengthened my admiration of your character. With each new day, I find myself further captivated by your beauty. Indeed, I cannot concentrate on anything for dreaming of your breathtaking smile. There is nothing at Netherfield that does not remind me of you. I see your loveliness in every flower in the garden, every book that lines the walls of the library, every drop of rain that falls over the fields. Your presence is felt everywhere and in everything, and I cannot imagine living there any longer without you as my wife. Please, tell me that I have a chance. Let me endeavor to make you happy for every minute of every day for the rest of your life. For you are all I could ever need to make me happy for the rest of mine. Elizabeth stared at him, unable to speak. Mr. Bingley was in love with her? It seemed impossible, considering she had done nothing but embarrass herself in his presence from the start, with her clumsiness and lack of decorum. It had never occurred to her to be anything but herself when she was around him, flaws and all. But then again, he never once seemed to mind. On the contrary, Mr. Bingley never seemed to notice Elizabeth's imperfections. He had always made her feel as though she didn't need to be perfect, unlike the men she typically went for. She had been so convinced Mr. Bingley was meant for Jane and not her, that Elizabeth never put up a pretense of perfection the way she did when she was around Mr. Darcy. She allowed him to see her for who she really was, a fun-loving, albeit accident-prone, hopelessly naive mess, and evidently he loved her for it. Perhaps Mr. Bingley felt the same way about her, and that was why he had fallen in love with her. Was it possible that Elizabeth made Mr. Bingley feel like he could just be himself, have imperfections, and not be thought less of for them? Did he love her because he knew he would never amount to the demands society placed on him, and Elizabeth had no demands at all? Elizabeth's life's fantasy, up until now, had been to find a Mr. Darcy, or in other words, the perfect man, and have him fall head over heels in love with her. Her fantasy did not include being romanced by Mr. Bingley, a secondary character that pales in comparison to the true hero of the story. And yet, here she was, smack in the middle of an actual fantasy. And Mr. Darcy was nowhere to be seen, as this absolute dreamboat of a man was literally kneeling before her, professing his undying love for her. In that moment, Elizabeth realized that her lifelong pursuit of Mr. Darcy had been in vain. He was not what she wanted after all. What she wanted, what she truly needed, was this beautiful, funny, honest man that was not afraid to be himself and act a little foolish now and then. Someone who made the most of life and was always up for anything, be it dancing in a ballroom or swimming in a muddy lake. A man who loved unconditionally and unselfishly, and who had helped her regain her self-confidence and overcome her fears. He had rescued Elizabeth in more ways than one since the first day they met. She knew then that she was in love with Mr. Bingley, that she had been in love with him since the first time he looked at her the way he was looking at her right now, as if nothing and no one else existed. He was all Elizabeth wanted, all she needed. She was about to give him her wholehearted consent when once again her sister's face loomed before her in her mind. Jane. Her sister was also in love with Mr. Bingley. Elizabeth overheard her say it herself at the ball. Elizabeth knew Jane would never forgive her if she knew she was in love with Mr. Bingley and wittingly took him from her. And Elizabeth could never knowingly hurt her sister, who was her other half, a piece of her own heart. Even in a fantasy, her happiness was more important to Elizabeth than her own. Shouldn't she then be the one to give him up? And then there was the painful reality that at some point this dream was going to end. Mr. Bingley wasn't even real. None of this was real. Elizabeth would eventually either succumb to her injuries out there in the real world, or she would wake up and find herself alone once more. The idea that she had finally found perfect happiness and would inevitably lose it forever was more than she could bear. Her eyes filled with tears. She knew what she had to do and what it was going to cost. With every ounce of willpower she could muster, Elizabeth whispered softly, "I wish I could, believe me. But I can't. I'm so sorry. If you are afraid to accept my hand because of your lack of fortune, you must know that it means nothing to me," he insisted. "No, it's not that. I promise it's not." Mr. Bingley blinked away tears before closing his eyes and nodding. He got to his feet slowly but did not let go of her hands. "Then you do not return my love?" It took everything within her not to throw her arms around him, kiss him, and tell him that she was crazy about him, that she had never loved anyone as much as she loved him, that she would continue to love him as long as there was breath in her body. But then she would have to tell him the truth. And Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to betray Jane's trust, especially when Jane hadn't even told Elizabeth that she loved him yet. It wouldn't be right to tell him something so personal before Jane had the chance to tell him herself. And Elizabeth certainly couldn't tell Mr. Bingley that he didn't exist. He would think she was as crazy as she was beginning to think she was herself. There was no other way to tell him that it was just not meant to be. So Elizabeth did the only thing she could think to do. She lied. "No, I'm sorry," she whispered as tears streaked down her face. Mr. Bingley staggered backward as though she had mortally wounded him with her words. "And you can offer no hope that you might ever feel differently?" he asked, his voice quavering with emotion. Elizabeth could not trust herself to speak. She couldn't even look up at him for fear he would see the truth in her eyes, in her gaze. Instead, she shook her head in silence, the tears coming faster as the last flicker of hope died out in his eyes. He exhaled deeply as he reluctantly let go of her hands. "Then I will bid you farewell, my darling, and wish you every happiness." Mr. Bingley turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone underneath the tree. As he mounted his horse, he gave her one last haunting look over his shoulder, Then he kicked his heels into Isabel's side and flicked the reins. She bolted forward, perfectly matched with Theodora by her side, and together they galloped away until they disappeared on the horizon. Elizabeth watched until she could no longer see him, then sank to the base of the tree and sobbed. For what seemed an eternity, she sat and cried until she had no more tears left. Then she walked slowly back toward the house and went straight to her bedroom. As she opened the door, she prayed that Jane would not be there, as she could not bear to answer her inevitable questions. Her sister was mercifully absent, however, and as Elizabeth peeled off her damp dress and changed into a clean chemise, she felt tears sting her swollen cheeks. She pulled back the covers on the bed and climbed in, then threw them over her head. Listening to the carefree twittering of the birds outside her window, she closed her eyes, allowing their sweet lullaby to carry her off into a deep but troubled sleep. When Jane entered the room hours later, she saw the trail of wet, muddy clothing and wondered what in the world her sister had been up to. She gently pulled the blanket back and saw her red, swollen eyes. Brushing her damp hair away from her forehead, she lovingly stroked her sister's tear-stained cheek as she watched her sigh in her sleep. She knew that Mr. Bingley had come that day to confess his love for Elizabeth, since he told her of his plan while they were dancing at the ball. In fact, he had reserved the first 2 dances with her for the sole purpose of asking her opinion on the matter. Jane, who had suspected his affection for her sister from the start, had encouraged him to wait a little longer, but he had been confident it was the right time. From the looks of things, Jane judged he did not receive the answer he had been hoping for. She assumed Elizabeth's affection for Mr. Darcy would render her unable to accept his proposal, but she did not want to betray her sister's trust. And now she worried she had done the wrong thing by not warning Mr. Bingley. Jane was certain she would never hear from Elizabeth's lips what had occurred that day. She had a feeling her sister believed her to be in love with Mr. Bingley herself, and that could not be further from the truth. It was not that she didn't think Mr. Bingley was an exemplary gentleman. She did. But it was not Mr. Bingley that she loved. That was a secret Jane would have to keep not only from Elizabeth, who she would never knowingly hurt, but also from the gentleman she knew in her heart she could never be worthy of. The romantic atmosphere of the ball may have persuaded her to hope. However, the ball was over now. The spell cast by the soft glow of candlelight the night before had been broken by the first rays of morning sun. That is the end of chapter 12, and we're going to move right along into chapter 13, which hopefully will be a little bit of comic relief instead of this. That was heavy. That was pretty heavy. So, see you next time.